My daughter, Sarah, had declared that I either had to do as her husband, Kevin, said or leave their home. Instead of reacting with anger, I just smiled. I picked up my suitcase and walked out, leaving behind the house I had worked so hard to pay for. She was likely expecting me to break down, as I usually did, but this time was different. A week passed, and I had already received 22 missed calls. This was just the beginning of what I had planned. They were going to regret what they had said and done. I pushed the front door open, my keys still warm in my hand. Grocery bags were digging into my wrists. The soft glow of the afternoon light, filtered through the living room curtains, usually brought a smile to my face, but not today. Kevin was stretched out on the leather recliner that my late wife, Eleanor, had given me before she passed away from cancer. His feet, covered only in socks, were propped up, and he dangled a half-empty beer bottle from his hand. He had the remote resting on his stomach as if he were the owner of the house, which I guess he believed he was. Without even looking away from the basketball game, he told me to get him another beer from the fridge while I was up. I slowly set the grocery bags on the floor, feeling the weight of the milk and bread. The plastic handles had left red marks on my hands. I told him I needed him to excuse me, and he replied that I had heard him, his eyes still glued to the TV. He specified that he wanted a Corona, not the cheaper beer I kept for myself. A cold feeling settled in my chest. I had bought those Coronas just for him, spending my Social Security money on beer I would never drink. I explained to Kevin that I had just arrived and needed to put the groceries away. He finally looked at me with that familiar expression, which seemed to say that I was being unreasonable and difficult. He asked what the big deal was, since I was already standing and he was comfortable. I calmly replied that this was my house, which was the big deal. Kevin's feet hit the floor with a thud, and he slowly stood up, using his height to intimidate me. He was in his 30s, bigger and broader than me, but I had been dealing with difficult people long before he was even born. He thought it was funny that I called it my house, since he and my daughter lived there. He insisted that they paid the bills with his money. With the beer still in his hand, he stepped closer. He told me we could do things the easy way or the hard way. He said that if I wanted to continue living there peacefully, I just had to do what he said. Just then, the kitchen door swung open, and my daughter, Sarah, appeared with a dish towel in her hand, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She took in the scene. Kevin was standing over me, and the tension in the room was palpable. She asked what was going on, her voice carrying that warning tone I remembered from her teenage years. Kevin replied that her father was being difficult, his eyes never leaving me. He explained that he had just asked me for a beer, and I was making a federal case out of it. Sarah looked at me with disappointment, as if I were a child who was misbehaving. "Just get him the beer, Dad," she told me, suggesting that it wasn't worth fighting over. But Kevin wasn't finished. He stepped closer, so close I could smell the alcohol on his breath. He told me that this was how things were going to be. Since I lived in their house, I was expected to do what I was told without question or attitude. My heart was hammering, but I managed to keep my voice even. Sarah stepped to her husband's side, showing they were a united front. She told me I had to decide right then. I could either help Kevin and do what he asked, or I could pack my things and leave. The words hung in the air like smoke. I looked at Sarah, searching for any sign of the little girl who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms. She stared back at me with the same entitled expression as Kevin. Quietly, I told her, "All right." Kevin smirked, thinking he had won. He said, "Good, now about that beer." I interrupted him by saying, "I'll pack." The smirk immediately vanished from his face. Sarah's mouth fell open, as if she had expected me to crumble and apologize. She had anticipated me shuffling to the kitchen like a beaten dog. I turned and walked toward the hallway, leaving the grocery bags where they sat. Behind me, I heard Kevin sharply inhale and my daughter, Sarah, whisper, "Wait, Dad." But I was already walking toward my bedroom, my footsteps steady on the hardwood floor that Eleanor and I had refinished together 2 decades ago. The suitcase came down from the closet shelf with a soft thump. I had bought it for our honeymoon to Yellowstone, back when Eleanor was still alive, and our future had seemed like an open road. Now it lay open on the bed, ready to hold what was left of my life in that house. I packed methodically, underwear, socks, 3 changes of clothes, not everything, just enough for a short time. From the living room, I could hear them whispering urgently. Kevin's voice would occasionally rise above Sarah's softer tones. They were trying to figure out what to do and how to handle my unexpected defiance. My hands moved without me having to think, folding shirts and rolling ties. I put the photo of Eleanor in the side pocket, wrapped in tissue paper. I packed my medications, reading glasses, and the small leather journal where I kept track of my expenses. When I wheeled the suitcase down the hallway, their whispers stopped. Kevin was back in his chair, but his posture was different, he was alert and watchful. Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, trying to look stern, but she couldn't hide her uncertainty. Neither of them said goodbye. My old Buick started on the first try, reliable as always. I backed out of the driveway without looking back to see if they were watching from the window. The 30-minute drive to Pine Lodge gave me a lot of time to think. As I drove through downtown, the memories came in waves. There was the $40,000 a year I had paid for Sarah's college tuition at that fancy private school she had insisted on. I had worked overtime at the bank for 4 years, taking on extra clients and staying late to review loan applications. My hands still cramped just from thinking about all those forms. Her wedding had cost $25,000. Kevin's family couldn't afford their share, so I had quietly paid for it all, not wanting to embarrass anyone. The reception hall, the flowers, and her dress, everything had to be perfect for my little girl's special day. Then came the house, with $80,000 from my retirement savings for their down payment, because I believed young couples needed help to get started. I had told myself that's what fathers do and that it's what Eleanor would have wanted. The monthly payments followed like clockwork, $1,200 for their mortgage, $300 for utilities, and $500 for groceries whenever money was tight. My Social Security check was consumed by their lives, piece by piece, and I had convinced myself that what I was doing was an act of love. Pine Lodge Motel was on the outskirts of town, a low building with faded paint and a neon sign that flickered on and off. The room was small, but it was clean. Inside, there was a bed, a chair, and a small table by the window. I put my suitcase on the luggage rack and sat down heavily on the edge of the mattress. The silence here felt different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of my own home, but the hollow emptiness of a temporary space. I took out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. I looked at the numbers for banks, insurance companies, and credit card services, all numbers I knew by heart from my 30 years in finance. Even though it would be Sunday, some things could still be done. I could still make some calls. I opened my laptop on the small table and logged into my online banking. The screen glowed with my account balances for checking, savings, and retirement, all numbers that represented a lifetime of careful planning and denying myself luxuries to take care of my family. The cursor blinked in the search bar, waiting for me to decide what to do next. Sunday morning was gray and overcast, which perfectly matched my mood. I spread my paperwork out on the motel table like a general planning a campaign, bank statements, insurance policies, legal documents, everything organized and within my reach. The first call I made was to First National Bank. Sunday banking was limited, but automated systems never slept. After I navigated through the phone tree, a representative greeted me and asked how she could help me. I told her I needed to cancel the automatic mortgage payment for the account ending in 4729, for the house on Pine Street. There was a pause as I heard computer keys clicking. The representative informed me that the payment had been active for 5 years and asked if I was sure I wanted to discontinue it. I confirmed that I was completely sure. She asked me why I wanted to make the change. I replied that the homeowners no longer qualified for my financial assistance. There was more clicking. She said that the automatic payment would be cancelled immediately and that I should receive written confirmation within 3 business days. The next call was easier. For 3 years, Geico had been insuring both of their cars on my policy, Kevin's Silverado and Sarah's Honda. It was $280 every month for vehicles I never drove and coverage for accidents I would never cause. I informed the agent that I needed to remove 2 vehicles from my policy, explaining that my daughter and son-in-law would need to get their own coverage. The agent asked when I wanted the change to take effect, and I told her, today. The credit cards took longer. Sarah was an authorized user on 3 of my accounts, Visa, MasterCard, and the Costco store card. I had been paying $500 a month on balances I had never created and for purchases I had never made. The Visa representative explained that removing them would require them to apply for their own credit. She mentioned that any outstanding balances would still be my responsibility, but they would no longer be able to make new charges. I replied that I understood and wanted them removed immediately. Each call felt like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. My 30 years of banking experience had taught me the ins and outs of the system, the legal language, and the proper procedures. Everything I was doing was completely within my rights. The life insurance change required written documentation, but I started the process anyway. It was $100,000 that was supposed to go to Sarah, money I had earned to protect my family's future. But now, family meant something different. By noon, I had made 8 calls. The mortgage payments were stopped, the insurance was cancelled, and the credit cards were blocked. The automatic transfers that had been draining my accounts for years had all been ended. Everything ended with polite conversations and confirmation numbers. I sat back in the cheap motel chair and looked at my notes. I saw a paper trail of my newfound financial independence, confirmation numbers, reference codes, and effective dates. My phone was silent on the table. There were no missed calls or urgent messages. They didn't know yet. They probably wouldn't know until the first payment bounced or the first bill arrived with their names on it, but they would know soon enough. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. Across the parking lot, an elderly man was putting suitcases into a pickup truck. His wife was gently and efficiently directing him. They were probably heading home from visiting their grandchildren or maybe starting a long-postponed vacation. I envied their easy partnership, the way they moved around each other with practiced familiarity. Eleanor and I had been like that once. My phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number, and I let it ring. The week that followed was quiet for me, but it was anything but quiet for them. I had settled into a routine at Pine Lodge, coffee from the lobby, breakfast at the diner down the street, and long walks around the quiet neighborhoods. My phone was collecting missed calls like a hobby I had no interest in starting. By Wednesday, there were 12 messages, and by Friday, there were 22. I listened to them in the order they were received, hearing them progress from confusion to anger to desperation. The first few calls were almost casual. Sarah was asking if there was some kind of banking error with the mortgage payment, and Kevin was leaving brief, annoyed messages about the car insurance lapsing. By the middle of the week, a sense of panic had crept into their voices. Sarah's voice cracked with frustration as she asked what was going on. She told me that the bank said I had stopped the automatic payment and that they wanted the full amount by Friday, or they would start foreclosure proceedings. Kevin's messages became increasingly aggressive. He told me that I needed to fix it right away, saying that people were asking questions about his insurance and that I was making them look like deadbeats. The later calls were almost begging. Sarah was crying and promising they would work something out if I just called them back. Kevin tried a different approach, saying that he had been too harsh and wanted to make things right. I deleted each message after listening, feeling only a mild curiosity about their growing desperation. Thursday morning, there was a knock on my motel room door. I looked through the peephole and saw them both, Sarah in a wrinkled sweater and Kevin in his work clothes. They both looked like they had not slept well. I opened the door but did not invite them in. "Dad," she said, her eyes red-rimmed and her usual composure completely gone. "We need to talk," she said, but I asked her, "About what?" Kevin pushed forward, his face flushed with anger, and told me that we needed to talk about the fact that I was trying to ruin their lives over some stupid argument about a beer. "I'm not trying to ruin anything," I said calmly. "I'm simply no longer paying for your lives." "The mortgage, Dad," Kevin's voice rose. "You can't just stop paying the mortgage. That's our house." "Actually," I told him, "it's my house. My name is on the deed, and my signature is on the loan. You two were just guests." Sarah grabbed Kevin's arm as he stepped closer to the door. "Dad, please, we can work this out," Sarah pleaded. She admitted that Kevin had been wrong to talk to me that way and that they both were. She said that I couldn't just leave without any warning or discussion. "You gave me an ultimatum," I reminded her. "Your exact words were, 'Do what Kevin says or get out.'" She replied that she didn't mean it that way, but I told her, "Yes, you did." I looked at my daughter, seeing a stranger wearing her face. I told her that she meant every word, she just didn't expect me to choose option 2. Kevin tried a different approach, his voice now artificially calm. He told me we had all said things we didn't mean, but that I was talking about their home, their credit, and their whole lives, and that I couldn't just pull the rug out like this. I replied that I could and that I had. I began to close the door. I told her that she wanted me to leave, so I did. I said that she had wanted to handle her own life, so now she could. "Dad, wait," Sarah said, and her voice broke. She asked what about our family and everything we had been through together. I paused, looking at her desperate face. For a moment, I remembered the little girl who used to help me rake leaves in the fall and who would bring me dandelions she had picked from the yard. But that little girl had grown into someone who could stand by while her husband humiliated her father in his own living room. "Family works both ways, sweetheart," I said quietly. "I spent 5 years taking care of you both. When it was time for you to take care of me, you chose him instead." Kevin's fake composure cracked, and he started to say something like, "You crazy old bastard, you can't just." But I interrupted him. I told him that I could call the police if he kept raising his voice because this was private property, and he was disturbing the peace. They stared at me, likely seeing me clearly for the first time in years. I was no longer the soft-hearted father and grandfather, no longer a convenient bank account with legs, but just a man who had finally learned to say no. Kevin grabbed Sarah's elbow and said that they would figure it out themselves. They walked back to their car, Kevin's swagger replaced by a worried hunch. Sarah looked back over her shoulder as if she were looking at a stranger. I watched them drive away, then closed the door and returned to my laptop. I still had more calls to make and more accounts to close. The work of dismantling a relationship was far from finished. I needed coffee and a chance to think clearly. The diner on Main Street had always been my refuge when Eleanor was alive. She would meet me there after her doctor appointments, and we would split a piece of apple pie and talk about unimportant things. Tuesday morning, I found myself walking the familiar 3 blocks, my breath visible in the crisp mountain air. The routine felt grounding after yesterday's confrontation. I had organized my paperwork again that morning, reviewing bank statements and confirmation numbers like a general studying battle plans. The diner's bell chimed when I entered. Coffee steam and bacon grease created a comfortable fog of normalcy that I craved. I had barely settled into my usual corner booth when a familiar voice called out, "George Miller." Well, I'll be damned. Robert, a man I had worked with at First National for 15 years before his transfer to the main branch, rose from a table near the window with a newspaper folded under his arm. Robert had handled commercial loans while I managed personal accounts, but we had shared enough coffee breaks to consider ourselves friends. I stood and shook Robert's hand, telling him it was good to see him. He asked if he could join me, saying he hadn't seen me since Eleanor's service. He slid into the opposite seat without waiting for an answer. He said he heard I had moved out to Pine Lodge and asked if everything was all right. The waitress appeared with coffee before I could answer. I used the interruption to consider how much I should share. Robert was trustworthy, but he was also a banker with professional obligations. It's a family situation, I said finally, explaining that I needed some space to think things through. Robert nodded slowly, studying my face. That son-in-law of yours tried to pull a fast one on us a few months back, he said. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. I asked him what kind of fast one it was. Robert's expression darkened as he told me that he had wanted a $50,000 home equity loan on my house, claiming it was his property and bringing in documentation and everything. The diner's ambient noise seemed to fade. I repeated back to him, my house. Then I realized that he was telling me he had owned my house. That's right, he said. He explained that there was paperwork that looked official at first glance, but when they ran the title search, he shook his head. Everything came back to me, of course, a clean title with no co-signers and nothing that would give him any claim to the property. I set my cup down carefully, trying to process this information. When exactly did this happen? I asked. Robert replied, December, maybe January. He added that he handled the application personally because of the amount involved. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. Robert explained that Kevin wasn't just mistaken about ownership. It was a deliberate fraud, and the documents he brought in were forged. The implications hit me like cold water. This meant that 3 months ago, Kevin had been planning to steal from me. This wasn't desperation born from our current crisis, this was a premeditated deception. I asked if he had reported it. Robert explained that they had rejected the application and flagged Kevin's information in their system. He mentioned that since no money had changed hands, it was a legal gray area, but he had kept copies of everything. Robert studied my expression. He asked if I really didn't know about this, and I shook my head, thinking about all the monthly payments I had been making, all the dinners where Kevin had complained about money troubles while he was planning to rob me behind my back. What was he going to use the money for? I asked. Robert glanced around the diner and then leaned closer. According to the application, the money was for home improvements, but Robert had heard around town that Kevin had pretty substantial gambling debts. How substantial? I asked. Robert said that James might know more, and he reminded me of Detective Morrison. He said that James had mentioned something about Kevin being a regular at Glacier Peaks Casino. I did remember James. We had served on the church building committee together, and his daughter had been in Sarah's graduating class. If James had information about Kevin's gambling, it was probably accurate. Robert, I said, I appreciate you telling me this. I pulled out my wallet to pay for the coffee I had barely touched. Robert told me to be careful, saying that a man who would forge documents to steal from his family might do other desperate things when he was cornered. I walked back to Pine Lodge with my mind racing. Kevin's beer demand and disrespect suddenly made a lot more sense. He had already seen me as an easy target, a convenient source of cash for his gambling habit. The ultimatum he gave me wasn't about establishing dominance. My inner monologue realized that his actions were about keeping access to funds he felt entitled to take. After returning to my motel room, I opened my laptop and created a new file for evidence against Kevin. Robert's revelation was only the start. I wondered what else he had been hiding if he had lied about this. The courthouse closed at 5 p.m., and I had just an hour to file the paperwork that would change everything. After lunch, I drove directly from the diner to the Flathead County Courthouse, a massive brick building that had once intimidated me but now felt like an ally. A professional and efficient middle-aged woman in the clerk's office on the second floor processed my eviction notice. The woman looked at the property deed I had provided and confirmed that I understood it was my daughter's residence. I explained that it was my property and that the residents had violated the terms of their occupancy. She asked me what terms they had violated. I replied that we had a verbal agreement that required mutual respect and contribution to household expenses and that both conditions had been violated. With practiced authority, she stamped the papers and told me that the 30-day notice period began today. She also said that if they contested it, we would have a hearing, but otherwise, the sheriff would serve the final papers after the deadline. I asked how long it would be before they received the papers. She replied that the sheriff's department handled the service of the process and that it was usually done within 48 hours. I thanked her and collected my copies, feeling the power of the law behind my actions. There would be no more financial manipulation or emotional blackmail. Everything would be handled through the proper legal channels. My next stop was the police station. Detective Jim's office was a small and cramped space in the back corner of the building, filled with filing cabinets and coffee-stained paperwork. Jim had aged since I had last seen him. He had more gray hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but his handshake was still firm. He asked what brought me to his corner of the world. I told him I was gathering information and that Robert had mentioned that he might know something about Kevin's gambling activities. Jim's expression became more professional as he asked me if I was talking about my son-in-law and what the context was. I gave him a brief explanation of the situation, including the ultimatum, my departure, and the attempted loan fraud by Kevin. Jim listened without interrupting and occasionally took notes. When I finished, he confirmed that Kevin was definitely known at Glacier Peaks. He explained that Kevin was a regular player, usually at the poker tables, and that staff had mentioned he had been playing more frequently lately at higher stakes. I asked if he had any idea how much Kevin owed. Jim said that he owed different creditors different amounts. They had received calls about collection issues, and while it wasn't criminal yet, it was headed in that direction. He estimated that the total was between $18,000 and $20,000. Those numbers staggered me. I realized that Kevin had been living in my house, eating my food, and demanding my respect while secretly losing enough money to buy a decent car. I asked who the creditors were. Jim replied that it was a mix of legitimate lenders and less than savory characters. The legitimate ones were getting impatient, and the others, he shrugged, didn't usually involve law enforcement in their collection methods. I asked about the timeline. Jim said that Kevin had been stalling for about 6 weeks. Most creditors give someone 3 months before escalating, so he was running out of time. I left the police station with a clearer picture of my son-in-law's situation. The gambling explained his desperation, his attempt to fraudulently mortgage my house, and his increasing aggression toward me. I wasn't just a convenient funding source, I was his only hope of avoiding serious consequences. That evening, I sat in my motel room reviewing the progress I had made. I had filed a legal eviction notice, and it was ready to be served. I had also confirmed Kevin's gambling debts and fraudulent activities. A growing network of professional allies now understood the real situation. I opened my laptop and updated my evidence file, adding Jim's information to Robert's revelations. Pattern recognition had always been a crucial skill in banking, and the patterns here were becoming crystal clear. Kevin wasn't just disrespectful or entitled, he was desperate, dishonest, and dangerous. I knew that the more pressure he felt, the more reckless he would become. I needed to be ready for whatever came next. I decided that tomorrow I would start making strategic phone calls to Kevin's creditors, not to pay his debts. The consequences were his to face, but I wanted to make sure they knew his true financial situation, including that he had no legal claim to my property. I knew the truth was always the best weapon. Word travels fast in a town like Kalispell. By Friday, I realized it was time to control the narrative. My first encounter happened at the post office, where Mrs. Henderson from the church mailing committee cornered me near the stamp machine. She was one of those women who gathered information like others gathered recipes, and she was always ready to share what she had learned. She told me that she had been hearing troubling things about my family and asked if everything was all right. I considered my response carefully, knowing that Mrs. Henderson would repeat whatever I said to at least a dozen people by the time of the Sunday service. I explained that Sarah and Kevin had asked me to move out, so I had. I told her that sometimes adult children needed to handle their own responsibilities. Her eyebrows rose in surprise, and she asked if they had told me to leave my own house. I told her it seemed like the best solution for everyone involved, but she asked if I hadn't paid for their wedding and helped them with the down payment. She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially, saying that she had always wondered how they afforded that house on Kevin's salary. I nodded but didn't elaborate, knowing that the facts would speak for themselves. My next stop was Miller's Hardware, where I had worked part-time after retiring from the bank. The owner, Tom, looked up from his inventory sheets with genuine concern. He told me he had heard I was staying at Pine Lodge and asked what was going on. 3 other employees gathered around as I explained the situation. Their reactions were immediate and unanimous. They were shocked that Kevin had treated me so disrespectfully and angry that I had been supporting them financially for years without any recognition. Dave, the assistant manager, shook his head in disbelief, asking if I had really paid for their college tuition. He said that Kevin had told everyone his family was well off and that they were helping me with my mortgage payments. I calmly replied that Kevin had said a lot of things that weren't true. Tom's expression darkened, and he said that it explained why Kevin always seemed to have money but never worked overtime. Tom said that they had offered him extra shifts plenty of times, but he always had other commitments. Sarah, from the paint counter, muttered that those commitments were probably at the casino. By the time I left the hardware store, I knew the real story would be all over town within hours. My town's network was more efficient than any advertising campaign. My third stop was St. Mark's Lutheran Church, where Pastor Williams was preparing for the weekend services. He invited me into his office, offering me coffee and a chair that had comforted many troubled parishioners over the years. He told me that several people had mentioned they were concerned about me and asked if I could help him understand what was happening. I appreciated Pastor Williams' direct approach. He wasn't fishing for gossip, he was trying to help a member of his congregation. I told the pastor that I had been financially supporting my daughter and son-in-law for 5 years. I explained that last weekend, they had made it clear that my being in the house was conditional on my following Kevin's orders, and that I had chosen to leave rather than accept that arrangement. He told me that must have been incredibly painful. I honestly replied that it was clarifying. I told him that I loved my daughter, but I would not be treated like a servant in my own home. Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully, and he said that sometimes loving someone meant allowing them to face the consequences of their choices. He added that it sounded like I had been protecting them from those consequences for a long time. I agreed and said, "Too long, I think." On my walk back to the motel, I stopped at Annie's coffee shop for an afternoon cup. The place was busy with the usual Friday crowd of retirees, off-duty workers, and mothers with strollers. I found a small table in the corner and listened to the conversations around me. I heard someone mention that Kevin owed money all over town. I also heard someone say that George Miller had been paying their bills for years and that it always seemed odd how they lived so well on his salary. The information was spreading exactly as I had expected. Small towns were like organisms, they processed information quickly and efficiently, using collective wisdom to separate truth from fiction. My phone rang as I was leaving the coffee shop. It was Mrs. Patterson, my next-door neighbor for 20 years. She said she hoped I didn't mind her calling, but she wanted me to know that there had been a lot of shouting at the house lately, mostly from Kevin, but from Sarah, too. She also said that the police had driven by twice yesterday. I thanked Mrs. Patterson for letting me know, and I told her that I appreciated her keeping an eye on things. Her genuine concern reminded me that community support came in many forms. I told her that I was fine and that I was just taking things one day at a time. That evening, I sat in my motel room, reviewing the day's conversations. The social pressure was building naturally, and I hadn't even had to try to be vindictive. People simply recognized injustice when they saw it clearly. My phone rang again. It was an unknown number, but I recognized the area code. It was most likely one of Kevin's creditors. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message. The voice on the message identified himself as Marcus Webb from Frontier Financial Services. He said he was looking for Kevin regarding a past due account and asked me to call him at my earliest convenience. They were calling me because Kevin had probably listed my house as his address on credit applications. This was more evidence of his deception and more proof that he had been planning to make me responsible for his debts. I deleted the message and opened my laptop. It was time to update my evidence file with today's discoveries. I should have expected them to fight back. Kevin was never one to go down quietly. Saturday morning started peacefully enough. I was reviewing bank statements over coffee when my phone started to ring. First, it was Tom from the hardware store, then Mrs. Henderson, and then Pastor Williams. Each call brought the same disturbing news. Kevin was going around town, spreading an alternative version of events. Tom's voice had barely controlled anger as he told me that he thought I needed to know what Kevin was saying. He explained that Kevin had come in about an hour ago, yelling and telling everyone that I had abandoned them without warning. He said that Kevin was claiming that I had promised to always take care of them but then had changed my mind out of spite. Tom said that Kevin was claiming that I was having some kind of mental breakdown. He also claimed that I had thrown them out because Sarah wouldn't let me control every decision in their lives. Tom paused, then added that Kevin was also claiming there was a family medical emergency that required money, and I was refusing to help. I thanked Tom and hung up, my mind already working through the implications. Kevin was desperate enough to launch a public relations campaign, which meant that the pressure from his creditors was intensifying. The next call confirmed my suspicions. It was Detective Jim. He told me he wanted to give me a heads up because Kevin had been there that morning, filing a complaint about elder abuse. He said that Kevin was claiming I was being manipulated by someone at the bank into making bad financial decisions. I knew this was complete nonsense. Jim told me that Kevin was trying to create an official record of my supposed mental incompetence. Jim had told him that they would need medical documentation and witness statements, which Kevin obviously could not provide. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was Sarah. She told me to please pick up because she knew I was angry, but there were things I didn't understand. Her voice was thick with tears as she told me she was pregnant and that the stress from all this was making her sick. She claimed the doctor said if things didn't calm down, she could lose the baby. I felt a familiar twist in my stomach, the same protective instinct that had made me vulnerable to their manipulation for years. But something in her tone seemed rehearsed and calculated, in a desperate way. I told her congratulations on the pregnancy and asked when she had found out. She replied that it was last week, right before everything fell apart. Her voice broke convincingly as she said that she could not lose her baby because of money problems and that I had always said family came first. I told her that family did come first, which was why I had spent $60,000 on her education and $25,000 on her wedding. She asked what about now and what about my grandchild. The question hung in the air. I knew that if she were really pregnant and if there were a real medical crisis, my actions could have unintended consequences. But the timing seemed too convenient, and the emotional manipulation was too practiced. I asked if she had seen a doctor about these pregnancy complications. There was a pause, and then she said she had an appointment next week. I asked her which doctor and she said Dr. Richards at the women's clinic. I knew Dr. Richards, Eleanor had seen her for years. I told her I would call her office to see how I could help with medical expenses. She told me I didn't need to call. I replied that if there were a genuine medical emergency involving my grandchild, I would want to help, and that Dr. Richards would know the best way to handle things. Sarah's voice became sharp, and she said I couldn't just call her doctor because it was private information. I replied that she was right, but she could have her call me directly to discuss payment options. The call ended abruptly. An hour later, I was walking downtown when I encountered Kevin outside the First National Bank. He was talking loudly to anyone who would listen, his voice carrying that aggressive edge I had learned to recognize. Kevin was saying to a small crowd of customers that I had lost my mind. He called me a senile old man who thought everyone was trying to steal from him and said I had kicked my own pregnant daughter out of the house over nothing. I approached calmly, and the crowd noticed me before Kevin did. Their faces turned in my direction, and their expressions shifted as they recognized the subject of Kevin's rant. Kevin spun around, his face flushing red, and he said, "There he is, the man who abandoned his own family." I kept my voice level and said, "Hello, Kevin. How's the gambling debt situation working out? The accusation hit him like a physical blow. Several people in the crowd murmured among themselves as the pieces of a puzzle clicked into place. Kevin sputtered that I was crazy and that he didn't know what I was talking about. I told him $18,000, according to Detective Jim. I added that he was mostly at the poker tables at Glacier Peaks Casino. I looked at the gathering crowd, saying it was amazing how much money someone could lose when they were not paying their own living expenses. Kevin's face went from red to purple. He stepped closer, using his height as a weapon. He started to call me a senile old bastard, but I interrupted him. I told him that I could document every dollar I had spent supporting him for 5 years. I asked if he could document where his paychecks went. The crowd was now listening intently, processing this new information. Kevin realized he had lost control of the narrative. He growled that it wasn't over and pushed his way through the crowd. I watched him storm away, noting that several people were pulling out their phones. The real story would be all over social media within the hour. Back at the motel, I opened my laptop and began documenting the day's events. Kevin's counterattack was failing because it was built on lies that could not withstand scrutiny. The community knew my character too well to believe his accusations of mental incompetence or vindictive abandonment. But the pregnancy claim worried me. I knew that if Sarah were really pregnant, the situation would become more complicated. I needed verification before making my next move. I picked up my phone and called Dr. Richards's office. If there were a real medical emergency, I would help, but I would not be manipulated by a fabricated crisis. Kevin's public threats had crossed the line. I walked back to my motel room, took out my phone, and called Detective Jim. I told Jim that we needed to talk and that Kevin's behavior today showed a pattern of escalation that concerned me. He asked me how so. I explained that he had confronted me publicly, made threatening gestures in front of witnesses, and that his whole demeanor suggested he was losing control. I looked out my motel window toward downtown. I told him I would like to file a formal complaint and explore protection options. He told me to come in tomorrow morning and bring any documentation I had. But I didn't need to wait until morning. Steve Brennan, the Pine Lodge night manager, knocked on my door an hour later. He told me that the man who had been yelling in the parking lot earlier had come back about 20 minutes ago. He said he had stood outside my door for about 5 minutes and then left, which had made some guests nervous. I knew Steve was a retired Army sergeant who had seen enough trouble to recognize it developing. I asked if he had said anything specific. He replied that he had muttered something about teaching old fools lessons and that he had it on security video if I needed it. Security footage, it was physical evidence of Kevin's threatening behavior on private property. I asked Steve if he would be willing to provide that footage to the police, and he said absolutely, because a guy like that shouldn't be intimidating elderly residents. The next morning, I arrived at the police station with Steve's security USB drive and a written timeline of Kevin's escalating behavior. Detective Jim reviewed everything with professional thoroughness. Jim said that it showed a clear pattern of intimidation. He explained that combined with what he had witnessed yesterday at the bank, they had grounds for a restraining order. I asked what that would involve. He explained that it was a legal prohibition against Kevin coming within 500 feet of me or my property. He said that any violation would mean immediate arrest. Jim leaned back in his chair and said there was something else I should know. He told me that Kevin had consulted with a lawyer on Friday about adverse possession laws. The words hit me like cold water. I thought to myself that he was talking about squatters' rights, and Jim confirmed that was exactly what he was talking about. Jim's expression was grim as he told me that Kevin had been researching whether he could claim legal ownership of my house based on living there continuously. He said that Montana required 5 years of hostile occupation, and they had been there for 3 years. He was planning to wait 2 more years before filing a claim. The implications staggered me. Kevin hadn't just been freeloading, he had been executing a long-term plan to steal my family home through legal technicalities. I asked if he had any legitimate claim. Jim said none whatsoever, explaining that adverse possession required hostile occupation without the owner's permission. He explained that since I had given them permission to live there and they had never paid rent or property taxes, there was no legal basis for his claim. Jim pulled out a file folder and said that it showed premeditation and that he had been planning this theft for years. I asked what about the restraining order, and Jim said he could fast-track it given the evidence and that I would have it by that afternoon. I left the police station with a new understanding of my son-in-law's character. The beer incident had not been about establishing dominance, it had been about maintaining a deception that would culminate in stealing my home. Walking back to my car, I took out my phone and scrolled through my contacts. It was time to make some strategic calls. The first call was to Marcus Webb at Frontier Financial Services, one of Kevin's creditors who had been calling my number. I returned his call and told him I was calling about Kevin. I clarified that Kevin no longer lived at my address and had no legal claim to my property. I explained that he had listed my address as his residence on all his credit applications, but that he was a guest in my home and I had evicted him last week. If you're looking for him, he works at Mountain View Auto Dealership on Highway 93. The second call was to Continental Credit Recovery. This is Clark Miller. You've been calling about Harry Thompson's debts. I want to clarify that Mr. Thompson has no ownership interest in my property and is no longer residing there. Each call was brief and factual. I wasn't paying Harry's debts or providing personal information, just correcting the false address he'd been using to avoid his creditors. By noon, I'd contacted 6 different collection agencies. Harry's carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. That afternoon, Judge Morrison signed my restraining order. Harry Thompson was now legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me or my property. Violation would result in immediate arrest and possible jail time. I drove back to Pine Lodge, feeling the satisfaction of justice properly applied. Harry had spent 3 years planning to steal my home. Now he couldn't even approach it legally. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This isn't over, old man." I forwarded the message to Detective Morrison, then blocked the number. Evidence collection had become second nature. Monday morning, I filed the restraining order. By noon, I was watching Harry's world collapse from multiple directions. The courthouse clerk stamped the final copy with efficient authority. "Mr. Miller, this order is effective immediately. Any contact or approach within 500 feet constitutes a violation." I thanked her and walked to my car, knowing the sheriff's deputy would serve Harry the papers within hours. My phone was already ringing. "Clark, this is Mike Brennan from Mountain View Auto." Mike was Harry's boss, a decent man who'd built his dealership on reputation and trust. "I need to ask you something directly. Are the things Harry's been saying about you true?" "What has he been saying?" "That you had some kind of breakdown and threw him out because of dementia. That there's a family medical emergency. And you're refusing to help." Mike's voice carried skepticism. "Thing is, Clark, I've known you for 20 years. This doesn't sound like the man who co-signed my son's first car loan." "Mike, Harry gave me an ultimatum to obey his orders or leave. I chose to leave. There's no medical emergency, and my mental faculties are fine as my banker, lawyer, and police detective can confirm." A long pause. "I was afraid of that. Clark, I've got 3 customers today who mentioned Harry owing them money. One recognized him from the casino. This is affecting my business." "I understand. I'm going to have to let him go. Can't have this kind of controversy around customers who trust us with major purchases." 20 minutes later, I was having coffee at Annie when I saw the first debt collector pull up to my former house, Continental Credit Recovery, based on the magnetic door sign. I'd spoken with them Friday about Harry's false address claims. My phone rang. Tiffany's number. "Dad, there are men at the house asking about Harry's debts. They want to know about our assets, our income, everything." Her voice carried genuine panic now. "What did you tell them?" "I told them the truth. That Harry doesn't own my property and no longer lives there. But they're talking about garnishing wages, seizing assets. Dad, I don't understand any of this. Sweetheart, that's what happens when someone borrows money they can't repay. Those are consequences Harry created, not me. $18,000. How is that possible? So, she really hadn't known the full extent. Gambling debts. Glacier Peaks Casino, according to Detective Morrison. Silence on the line, then quietly. He told me he was working overtime those nights. I'm sorry you're learning this way, Tiffany. And the sheriff's deputy was here, too. Served Harry some kind of legal papers. He's been ranting and throwing things ever since. The restraining order. Harry was probably just realizing that his options had evaporated completely. Dad, he's talking about leaving town. Says there's nothing left here for him. Her voice cracked. What am I supposed to do? Make decisions based on who Harry really is, not who you hoped he was. That evening, I parked across the street from my former house and watched the chaos unfold. 3 different creditor vehicles had visited during the day. Mrs. Patterson next door waved at me sadly. She'd been watching the situation develop with the concern of a longtime neighbor. Through the living room window, I could see Harry and Tiffany arguing. His gestures were aggressive, desperate. Hers looked defensive, frightened. The fairy tale marriage built on my financial foundation was crumbling as reality intruded. My phone buzzed. A text from Steve at Pine Lodge. That guy tried to get in the building again, told him about the restraining order. He left, but he was really angry. I forwarded the message to Detective Morrison. Harry was violating the restraining order within hours of being served. His desperation was making him reckless, which made him dangerous, but it also made him predictable. A desperate man with gambling debts, no job, and legal troubles, had limited options. He could face his responsibilities like an adult, or he could run. Given what I'd learned about Harry's character, running seemed most likely. I drove back to Pine Lodge, considering the implications. If Harry fled town to escape his creditors, what would happen to Tiffany? Would she go with him, choosing loyalty to a man who deceived her for years? Or would she finally see him clearly and make a different choice? Either way, the consequences were theirs to face. I'd spent 5 years protecting them from reality. That protection had ended the day they asked me to choose between my dignity and their demands. I'd chosen dignity. Now they could choose their own path forward. 2 days of watching their desperation was enough. I called Tiffany Wednesday morning and told her to meet me at the diner. Just her. I can't leave Harry alone right now, Dad. He's really struggling with everything that's happening. Then we have nothing to discuss. The restraining order means I can't be around him anyway. A long pause. Where do you want to meet? Main Street Diner, 2 o'clock, back corner. Booth where we can talk privately. I arrived early and chose the booth facing away from the street. I wanted this conversation to focus on words, not worried glances at passing cars. When Tiffany arrived, she looked older than her 28 years. Stress lines around her eyes, nervous fidgeting with her purse strap. She slid into the opposite seat and immediately started talking. Dad, I know you're angry, but Harry's lost his job, and these debt collectors won't leave us alone. The phone rings constantly. People are showing up at the door demanding money we don't have. I waited until she finished, then spoke calmly. I'm offering you one chance to end this with some dignity, Tiffany. What do you mean? Public acknowledgement of the truth. Full disclosure of how much I've supported you both and an honest explanation of why I left. Her face flushed. You want me to humiliate myself in front of the whole town? I want you to tell the truth. There's a difference. What kind of acknowledgement? I'd spent 2 days thinking through exactly what justice required. Church announcement Sunday during testimony time. Letter to the editor of the Tribune. Facebook post visible to all our mutual connections. Full details about college tuition, wedding costs, mortgage payments, and the ultimatum that caused me to leave. Dad, people will think. People will think you had a father who loved you enough to sacrifice his retirement security for your happiness and that you took it for granted until it was gone. Tiffany stared at her untouched coffee. What about Harry? Harry is no longer part of any equation involving me. The restraining order is permanent. If you choose to stay married to him, that's your decision. But it means choosing him over any relationship with me. You're asking me to choose between my husband and my father. I'm asking you to choose between a man who threatened me and a man who raised you. The fact that you see those as equivalent choices tells me everything about how far we've drifted apart. She was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. What about the house? It's been in our family for generations. It's going to the Montana Veterans Housing Initiative. 3 families of veterans will live there. People who understand what service and sacrifice actually mean. The words hit her like a physical blow. The will already changed, witnessed, signed, and filed with my attorney. I kept my voice gentle but firm. Even if you do everything I've asked perfectly, the house won't come back to you. That decision is final. Why? Because I need to know that any reconciliation between us is based on love, not inheritance expectations. For 5 years, you treated me like a convenient funding source. I want to see if there's anything left between us beyond financial dependency. Tiffany's eyes filled with tears. Real ones this time, not the calculated manipulation I'd grown accustomed to. I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. I never meant for things to go this far. Sorry isn't enough anymore, sweetheart. The whole town watched you, and Harry treat me like a servant in my own home. They watched you choose his demands over my dignity. Words are just words now. I need to see actions. What if I can't do it? What if I can't stand up in front of everyone and admit how wrong we were? Then you'll live with the consequences of that choice. Harry will probably leave town to escape his creditors. Men like him always run when things get difficult. You can go with him and start over somewhere else, or you can stay here and try to rebuild your life with honesty. And if I do what you're asking, then maybe over time we can build a real relationship, not based on money or guilt or obligation, but on mutual respect between 2 adults. Tiffany wiped her eyes with a napkin. How long do I have to decide? Sunday morning. Church starts at 10 o'clock. If you're not there to tell the truth, I'll know you've made your choice. She stood slowly, looking older and more fragile than when she'd arrived. Dad, do you think you could ever forgive me? I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw glimpses of the little girl who used to braid dandelions into crowns and demand bedtime stories about brave princesses. Forgiveness and trust are different things, Tiffany. I forgave you the day I decided to leave rather than fight, but trust has to be earned back, one honest action at a time. She nodded and walked toward the door, shoulders bent under the weight of a decision that would determine the rest of her life. I remained in the booth, watching her drive away. Sunday was 4 days away. By then, I would know whether my daughter had the courage to choose truth over comfort, responsibility over loyalty to someone who had never deserved it. Sunday morning arrived clear and cold. I walked into St. Remarks, wondering if Tiffany would find the courage to tell the truth. The sanctuary was fuller than usual. Word had gotten around about some kind of family announcement. I took my regular pew 3 rows from the front and waited. Pastor Williams began the service with familiar hymns and readings, but I could feel the congregation's anticipative energy. When testimony time came, Tiffany stood from the back row. She looked small walking down the center aisle, but her steps were steady. At the podium, she gripped the edges and looked out at faces she'd known her entire life. I need to tell you all something important about my father, her voice carried clearly through the silent sanctuary. For the past 5 years, Clark Miller has been supporting my husband and me financially. He paid $160,000 for my college education when I could have gone to a state school. He paid $25,000 for my wedding when Harry's family couldn't afford their share. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. These were specific numbers, documented sacrifices that painted a clear picture. He gave us his family home, the house his parents left him, where he'd lived with my mother for 20 years. When we couldn't make mortgage payments, he paid them. When we needed groceries, utilities, car insurance, he paid for everything while living on Social Security. Her voice strengthened as she continued, 3 weeks ago, when my father wouldn't follow my husband's orders like a servant, we gave him an ultimatum. Obey Harry or leave his own house. Dad chose to leave rather than surrender his dignity. The sanctuary was completely silent now. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of her words. I stood by and watched my husband disrespect the man who sacrificed his retirement security for our comfort. I chose loyalty to someone who threatened my father over loyalty to the man who raised me with love and patience. Tears flowed freely now, but her voice remained clear. I'm standing here because my father offered me one last chance to choose truth over pride. I was wrong. Harry was wrong. My father deserved gratitude and respect. And instead we gave him ultimatums and demands. She looked directly at me. Dad, I'm sorry isn't enough for what we put you through. But I'm hoping it's a start. The congregation erupted in supportive murmurs as Tiffany returned to her seat. Pastor Williams approached the podium with tears in his own eyes. Sometimes the hardest courage is admitting our mistakes publicly. Tiffany has shown that courage today, and her father has shown us what dignity looks like under pressure. After the service, people approached me with embraces, handshakes, and words of support. Mrs. Henderson squeezed my hand. We all suspected you were helping them financially, Clark. What we didn't know was how they repaid your kindness. Tom from the hardware store clapped my shoulder. That took real character, what you did. Setting boundaries isn't easy when family's involved. But the most meaningful moment came when Tiffany approached me outside the church. The letter to the Tribune will run Wednesday. The Facebook post goes up tonight. She hesitated. Harry left town yesterday, packed his truck while I was at work and disappeared. No forwarding address, no note, nothing. I wasn't surprised. Men like Harry always ran when confronted with consequences. I'm sorry your marriage ended this way. I'm not, she said quietly. I filed for divorce this morning. Found out he'd been using my credit cards for gambling without telling me. The debts are worse than we thought. 3 months later, I stood in the front yard of my former family home, watching 3 veteran families move into the transitional housing units the Montana Veterans Housing Initiative had created. The house had been renovated into separate apartments, each family getting privacy while sharing common areas. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, recently returned from deployment, directed her 2 children toward the playground equipment donated by local businesses. Mr. Miller, this opportunity means everything to us. Thank you for choosing veterans for this gift. Veterans understand sacrifice, I replied. This house should serve people who've actually earned it. My own life had settled into peaceful routines at the lakeside cabin I'd purchased, with money no longer flowing to ungrateful dependents. Morning coffee on the deck overlooking Flathead Lake. Afternoon fishing, evening reading, simple pleasures that felt luxurious after years of financial stress and family drama. The cabin was small but perfectly suited to my needs, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen where I could cook actual meals instead of eating restaurant food constantly, and a dock where I could launch my small fishing boat. My phone buzzed with a text from Tiffany. Dad, I'm 3 months into counseling and learning a lot about healthy relationships. Could we try having coffee sometime? I'd like to earn your trust back, one conversation at a time. I smiled, looking out at the lake where an osprey was fishing in the shallows. Tiffany had kept her word about the public acknowledgments. The newspaper letter had been thorough and honest. The Facebook post had generated dozens of supportive comments from community members who finally understood the real story. More importantly, she was taking responsibility for rebuilding our relationship instead of expecting forgiveness without effort. I typed back, "Coffee sounds good. Saturday morning at the diner." Her response came immediately. "I'll be there. And Dad, thank you for not giving up on me completely." I set the phone aside and watched the osprey rise from the water with a fish in its talons. Sometimes patience and dignity were rewarded, even when the wait seemed endless. The sun was setting over the Rockies, painting the lake surface gold and orange. In the distance, I could hear children laughing at the veterans' housing complex, families building new lives in the home where I'd learned the difference between generosity and enabling.